Yorker after 9/11, Adam Zagievsky's Try to Praise the Mutilated World, and Vijay Seshadri's The Disappearances, W.S. Merwin's To the Words, Deb Garrison's I Saw You Walking. You could feel the palpable impact of poetry in that moment. So it only took me about 10 seconds to say, sure, I'll try to put this together. And then I compiled a wish list. I'm up here in Millerton. I don't have access to all of my Rolodexes and address books, but by trawling around in my PSA account and my private account, I put together a list of 125 poets. There were large gaps. So when I reached out to the 125 poets, I attached that list of 125 names and said, if you know of other poets who are writing now, or if there are favorite poets of yours who aren't on this list, and I'm sure there are many, please send me their email addresses. So within days, I was corresponding with well over 200 people.
That's amazing. The themes and the language and the forms of the poems are as varied as the poets themselves. But yet when I was reading the collection, it was so interesting to see the common threads that emerged. As individual as all of our experiences have been, nearly everyone on the planet has shared in this experience. And as in your title, a line from Neruda says, "Together in a sudden strangeness." What are your thoughts on the similarities and the uniqueness of the poems?
Well, you know, I was listening today to the audiobook, and the more I dwell in these poems, the more they do speak to each other. I mean, there are poems, Deborah Garrison's poem about her daughter graduating speaks to Garrett's poem about being under the full moon with his somewhat grown daughter, I think. Thomas Morin's poem about his little children speaks to Matthew Zapruder's poem about his little children, but beyond the subjects, because the poems are very reflective of the various temperaments and sensibilities and circumstances and backgrounds of this huge variety of poets. You know, the poem remains, as Stevens said, the cry of its occasion. And these poems have been occasioned by something that we are sharing together. And a lot of uncertainty and fear and grief. And, you know, some poems reflect greater solitude and are graver and haunting, and some, but what really struck me, Gretchen, was, I'm going to quote something else, and that's Robert Frost saying, a good poem should be like ice on a hot stove. It should ride on its own melting. And what really struck me about so many of these poems, and you're going to hear this in Susan Mitchell's poem, is how swervy they are and how surprising the turns in them are. And at the same time, like ice on a hot stove, there's an inevitability to the emotional experience. And when we read these poems, I think we experience that kind of inner shift in consciousness, which poems are made to register and share, I think.
It was a very emotional experience for me to read this collection. And there's a wide range, as you said, everything from despair and loneliness to great hope. And I was thinking about the fact that we were told to all stay at home in March, and I wondered what some of the poems would have been like, or if the response would have been a little different in the more hopeful poems if we'd been told to stay at home in January. I think we were very fortunate that our stay-at-home orders went into effect close to spring coming to be. And there were a lot of springtime images, of course, in those hopeful poems, which were really beautiful.
I agree with that. If we were housebound in winter, it would be very different. And yet, there has to be also a consciousness that our circumstances are really, really different from one another. And, you know, my circumstance up here in Millerton is very different from the sirens I was hearing when I spoke to my friends in New York, and the talk of refrigerated trucks and bodies outside the hospitals. And, you know, I was really struck by the opening of a poem by Tim Donnelly. And it's kind of sharp reckoning. It begins, "Tonight a great wind blows hard against the building, as if we were at sea, as if we were at war, and I, some royal personage, kept far from care." So he knows his circumstance is not as perilous or frightening as that of others. And I think that the moment that we're in right now is embryonically, or was embryonically, tucked into the just previous moment, because a lot of these poems, and particularly the apocalyptic poems, address the inequities that are so heightened for us right now. You know, inequities in access to healthcare and to groceries and to fresh air and to money and to housing and all of that. And yet they're very surprising, and many of them are charming, and all the atmosphere of so many is very, very varied. And but I think the sacred aspect of spring does come through Gretchen very strongly.
There's some wonderful images. There was so much light and sunlight despite the darkness. And there was also a surprising amount of wind in the poems, a lot of references to the wind.
Yes, I noticed that too. And I wonder whether that's because when you step back from the bustle and the cars and the noise, we actually hear the air and hear the wind differently.
Right. There were some incredible images. You know, there are poems that talk about Zoom meetings, and poems about that reference John Derrick's famous and beautiful wives, of all things. I didn't see that coming. And kids in trees half drunk on mulberries, as you have mentioned, and 10 boxes of matzah that mistakenly appear on somebody's doorstep with the delivery man. And my favorite description of all that I've heard yet to describe the pandemic is a pineapple upside down cake in Tomas Morin's poem, which I love.
That comes in a poem that begins with a sneeze. That's that Tomas Morin poem that begins with a sneeze. And when he sneezes, his mother-in-law says, "Valleo." And it's just, but that poem goes in many different directions.
Right.
Too. Ends with an image that is out of Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I imagine that the book will take on a different purpose as we move ahead. Often when we read a poem, we don't have the advantage of knowing what circumstances prompted the poet to write the poem, or under what conditions it was written, or what the poet was responding to. These are occasional poems in response to this incredible historical event. And who knows what the world's going to look like in November when the hardcover edition comes out. In a year, 5 years, 10 years, how do you think the experience of reading these poems will change?
Well, you know, Gretchen, I reached out to so many poets, and the rate of success in terms of acceptance was really pretty high. Like 1 out of 3 poems seemed to me to immediately slip into my bloodstream and fit into this book. So I think people were very self-selecting, and that poets who didn't feel that they were producing work that was their best work didn't send me something. They wanted to be represented by their best poems. So I do think that the book will have an enduring quality. I mean, it will certainly serve as a marker for all of us who've lived through this period. And it's a very heightened period. I mean, I've seen foxes throughout my life, but I'm never going to forget the 3 foxes that I saw last week in your area, in our area, and the 3 blue herons I saw on my bicycle. I mean, everything is very enshrined right now. And I think we will revisit this moment. And, you know, that's why this Neruda poem, from which the title is taken, is so marvelous. You know, he says, you know, let's stop for a second. It would be an exotic moment without rush. We'd all be together in a sudden strangeness. Perhaps the earth can teach us, as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. So that speaks to the spring aspect of this too. But we will have, at some point we will have survived this, those of us who do survive, together. And it's a very profound experience.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Alice. And I think everyone would really love to hear from the poets now. So if you'd please introduce them, we will unmute them one at a time.
Great.
We're beginning with Billy Collins.
Great. Well, I'm just going to say where everybody is, because I think we want these windows thrown open. And these poems come from all over the country. So Billy is in Winter Park, Florida.
Alice, I wanted to thank you for bringing us all together and turning us into contributors to one big occasional chorus responding to what we're all going through. I thought the most common thing that people are experiencing is either being alone or being with repetitive company or limited company. And for many of us, I think there's something that Wordsworth called the bliss of solitude. But for many, it's more like wandering lonely. And I presume to imagine a couple for which their solitude is not blissful. The poem is called Sequestration. No one's going anywhere, and they say it's like this all over, the rooftops and the quarters of the world. Whenever a doorbell buzzes, a man and a woman freeze in place. No one wants to touch the package left on the welcome mat. Sometimes she'll get up from reading everybody's horoscope to have a look in the pantry, or he will draw back a curtain and see a man below on the street vanishing around a corner. Mostly, there is nothing to do. They sit in separate rooms, guarding their own lives. Two pilot lights flickering where their hearts used to beat.
Thanks, Billy.
You're welcome.
For that. Garrett Hongo is joining us from Eugene, Oregon.
Watching the full moon in a time of pandemic. I watch the full moon's light slide like silver water through the silhouettes of trees that cast long shadows over mounds and rocks, a hidden stream and the expanse of lawn. I think back to when I played hide and seek games with cousins at the shoreline, Pupukea near Shark's Cove on Oahu, dodging in and out of the shadows of ironwood trees. We hid amidst the vapors of murk mixed with sea spray and wild laughter, sought one another in sands under the glassy moonlight that splashed our bodies like surf. We stood as though rooted, silent while sighs from the sea carried through cool night air. I was 4, or I was 5, and I was not Leanne or Neil or Carrie, but myself, counting my own breath, one with the dark, gazing at the silver gleam of heaven's road, making its path from below the moon, across heaving purple waters to where I stood, as I do tonight, 60 years from that first shining. I told it to my daughter, who hid in moonshade, isolate and lonely, missing the welter of what life had been. Her father, 5 as a child, unfathomable, her slim form disappearing, while I stood seeking.
Garrett, that poem is so emblematic of the lyric cry, the cri de coeur. It's really wonderful. Fanny Howe is joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
I think. Last year, I visited a friend in County Mayo in Ireland, and I thought I would love to live there, as even though I was a old hag by then, where the natural world is undefeated by human interference. And I wrote this short poem called Balina, where an island well is helped by the pebble on the left, so the one behind it can slip a bit to let the water up. Now it's a bungalow built from grit and shells, hellebore growing by the door, a granny sometimes to be there, bent in a chair, laughter not far. Please God, so.
Thanks, Fanny. So Dee Dee and Major are a couple who've been writing, if I'm correct, every day since you've been sequestered. Am I correct about that? And Dee Dee, you're going to start, I think. They are joining us from South Burlington, Vermont.
Yes, yes. We did do a series where I think we limited it to like 7 days on of writing every day, and then we do take a break and then go back into it. And this poem that I'm going to read was actually written on the Ides of March, titled "The Ides of March," and I felt that the chaos and the experience of Ides of March was similar in what was going on with the pandemic. So I felt like those things were familiar in that way. So Ides of March, 2020. Two doves land in the moss below the feeder, sunbathe in the last light of the early spring day, then huddle on the lower branch of the ancient berry tree, where we wait to see them mate. By today, the newest plague has killed thousands in Italy. So any life is good. The 2016 Viverti Dolba, although not communion, feels sacred, as do our crackers and cheese, our hike under a biblically blue sky, our fire raging in its cage when we return home. I have complained about so much for so often. How now do I love that tiny fellow chipmunk who, on his hind legs, checks the celestial movement of the sun before digging what I imagine are the Christian catacombs under our foundation. He has a mission, so should I. No rain today fell into the open graves of the dead, only a sunset and life as we know it.
Thank you, Dee Dee, so much. And now Major's going to read his poem, Invocation.
Alice, thank you for, you use the word that I want to employ here, and that's enshrined. And I was thinking about at the beginning of the pandemic, this global health crisis, how so much of the past seemed marked for the fact that it would not be replicated, of course, but also that we are profoundly changed. And I feel as though so much of what happened last summer, I wish I had the foresight, or at least to have treasured it. Just the mere gathering of friends, the hug that was taken for granted, that is habituated. I also thought about, in that regard, I also thought about this maybe overwrought belief I have in the ability of humankind to address any issue that faces us. And that progress is this thing that I always presumed that we would march towards. Nothing like a plague to test the collective intelligence of us all. So that is the germ of the poem. It's called Invocation. Of course, invocation is prayer. Down here, we've inherited an arcade of stars and want kindness that can stop a bomb. We want intelligence that survives mutations. No more rallies of hate, no more stone mountains, just proliferating peaks and the presence of friends like magical wands. We want the father in the park running behind a child pedaling into her future. We want to turn a corner and stumble upon the muted concept of two in an embrace with entangled eyes. We want to hear a distant train whistle cast a spell on the coming night. Back in that faraway land, we were nurtured on a dance floor, blazing in some tribal purity, probably near some bride, probably swirling in sweaty laughter, as we reach for the tips of each other's fingers streaming their ambient light. Such were the new bursts of ourselves, breaching horizons like a sting. This is not the ending we imagined. We want to see each other again. Strangers walking through curtains of rain, storms lighting up pastures laden with blossoms.
Thank you, Major, so much. Susan Consolving, My Near Neighbor in Lakeville, Connecticut.
Unmute.
Oh,
Did I do it?
you did.
All right. Well, I'll begin with structure. I didn't know what to do, and I thought, well, COVID-19, a villanelle is 19 lines long, so maybe that will work. And then I went and made soup. Now my freezer is full of soup. And I thought, why am I doing this? And that became the content of the poem, as well as the content of my freezer. My heart cannot accept it all. Forgive yourself for thinking small, for cooking soups, ignoring blight. The mind cannot contain it all, despite intent and wherewithal. It's little stuff that brings delight. A book, a drink, keep thinking small, a bubble bath, an odd phone call, resisting all those gigabytes. Your mind will not embrace it all. Quarantine is one long haul. As days grow long, so do the nights. Forgive yourself for thinking small. Popcorn, TV, more alcohol. There's no need to be contrite. The mind cannot believe it all. This vast and shocking viral sprawl, infections with no end in sight. Forgive me, please. I'm thinking small. My heart cannot accept it all.
That's the perfect form for that, Susan. For anything that has to do with loss, really. So Susan Mitchell is here from Boca Raton, Florida.
Let's see.
We've had a little dance in Major's poem, and her poem is called The Dance.
Susan, are you able to hit the red mic at the bottom of your screen to unmute? She is not unmuting. Let's see. Okay, she should be on now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. This is a poem that came very fast. I had gone to New York for surgery at Columbia Presbyterian at the end of February. Everybody was already coughing there. And I stayed in New York till March 7th. Everyone was coughing in LaGuardia. And I came back to a Boca Raton when I went into the supermarket the next day, nothing on the shelves. And 2 days later, I found out I'd be teaching my 3 courses remotely. And I am not a tech whiz by any means. So when I first saw my students and they all saw each other via WebEx, we were all just kind of amazed. after a week of seeing all these images of students in 3 classes, the poem started with a thought that, my God, I'm existing as an image and all these other people, and that's the way the dead come to me. My memories of family, friends, the way people come to me in dreams. And then maybe because I had just been in New York, I remembered all those small apartments on the Upper West Side where writers, artists, professors, people get together and, you know, have these very intense conversations. So the poem starts in New York. The dance. No, they don't make them the way they used to. Conversations with real cornices and windows overlooking parks where children played and old men fed pigeons while they talked and waved to others just arriving. Conversations stuffed with oysters and oranges and glasses of red wine that kept spilling. Never a lull, never an intermission, and who knew or cared the next morning whose glasses we drank from? Let it come, we said, and it came in hordes, stomping snow off boots, shaking rain from umbrellas and hats. We had to turn. We were always turning around to see who was pushing into what we were joking or shushing about. Not to miss a word, a crumb. No, they don't make conversations with tier on tier of balconies, with real breath that whiffed of garlic and turmeric until all rooms were thick with it. Even the half-dark bedrooms piled with coats where phones rang and someone kept shouting, "Why not?" And those who left went on talking down narrow stairs with death-defying leaps into subways at rush hour. And if a stranger or two joined in, the conversation knew how to expand like tables with extra panels that can always make room for more. Yes, those were conversations that could dance us off our feet, make us dizzy with twirling, the way they spun round on round and left us. Nothing ends when it seems to end, we said, or begins when it seems to begin. Left us so out of breath, we had to stop for a moment. Just a stitch in the side, we said. Just the twitch of a muscle, a tickle in the throat that made us cough hard enough to turn off our mics when we zoomed across time zones, turn off the video so no one would see us propped on pillows. A bad hair day, we bluffed at meetings as we hid behind medallions bearing our initials, so no one would know how we'd been strained to thin gruel, a clear consommé with no more substance than images we embraced wildly in dreams. Is it you? Is it really you? Before we woke and remembered who was dead.
Gretchen, I think that's such an example of how the poems in the book will live beyond this moment. All of the poems are, because people have found a way to write their kind of poem. And it's just such a powerful gathering. So Rex, you are joining us from Venice, California for Canal Nocturne.
That's right. It's interesting. I was thinking about this poem today, which is a good thing since I'm going to read it. And I was thinking how it really was written in a more innocent time. And I was thinking, what a strange thing to say, innocent. But there were probably a week or two earlier in the pandemic when we weren't laughing very much. It was surreal. We didn't really know if, perfect example is my daughter used to watch all these Walking Dead, zombie apocalypse movies. And I used to tell her, you know, this doesn't actually happen. And she says it could happen. And there, when I was writing this poem at the same time, she would look at me and go, I told you so. And because now we can laugh, but for a little while we couldn't. Okay, this is called Canal Nocturne. A walk through a canal at a time when most people are home, and not a cloud in the sky, nor in the sky's reflection on the water. But there is a difference, and only I am there to notice. The water sky is a denser color by far than the dry sky above, which is the real world, bleached out by lights and virus, studded with sounds and filled from every corner with threats, from within and without. Only the harmless crabs and sea slugs, silhouettes and shadows, tenant the 3 feet deep. A few fish, Mill, narrowly realize themselves. This is not the first night I've noticed, looking down, that several stars have shown that did not twinkle above, weren't there at all. For all the real and reality, experience tells me this reflection is what our embracing arms were made for. For weeks, we have been advised not to hug, nay, ordered, just as even the most cold-blooded of us felt the need. This morning, CNN announced even an innocent exhale can kill. We are stranded, too near each other to breathe.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sure that our audience has some questions. You can put them into the chat box or use the raise hand feature. To speak with our poets this evening. Are there any questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
At the Academy of American Poets, every day they have a poem a day, which is free at poets.org, and it's a poem by a person who's been published by an established press, but it's a new poem. And at the end of the poem, they say what caused them to write it. And maybe it might be interesting in this anthology to collect a similar statement from the poets about what caused them to write their poem.
Thank you.
Any other comments, responses?
Okay.
Could we ask you to mute yourselves if you're not asking a question? Thanks.
Sounds like there's a bird zooming around somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. May I ask if you could give me the full name of the book and who's publishing it, and so I can grab it as soon as I
We will send you a link out after this. The link to buy it from a bunch of different places, including your local independent bookstore.
But Holly, this might be a good moment to express something that I don't quite mechanically understand myself, and that is that this is an eBook. So it's an electronic book. It was published on June 9th. And when we published the book in hardcover in November, we now have another 20 poems, and the ebook will simultaneously update. But what's so fascinating is if you buy the ebook now and you access it in November, it will automatically update so that you'll have the other 20 poems, which I think is amazing. And I don't understand quite.
There are some impressive things about technology sometimes. It's
Yeah.
not just all there to taunt us.
I'm going to read a question that's in the chat box for everyone. There is a lot of nostalgia in these poems for life before the pandemic, very poignant. I wonder if any of the poems see any positives to the pandemic or the ways it has influenced their writing. And type, sorry, I mean any of the poets.
I'll speak to that. One of the things, and this is terribly ironic, because so much closed in New York, the Metropolitan Museum, Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, for the first time, I've been able to get streaming music on a daily basis, not just WQXR, which I get, and talks coming from the Metropolitan Museum, from the Frick, that have just utterly enriched my life. And the other thing that happened that's utterly amazing, I'm about to take, I've studied piano for many, many years, but I haven't had a piano teacher in Boca. And I'm about to study with an incredible pianist and teacher at the New England Conservatory of Music, who's just accepted me as his student. So for me, you know, this is marvelous. At the same time, I'm aware, I'm horrified by so much that's going on. I mean, such horrific things. And I was already hearing about it in New York, that I don't know. That's all I can say. But definitely, I've had positive experiences. At the same time that I live in a state of high anxiety on the few occasions I go out to shop for food, because I'm in 2 high-risk groups, so it's scary.
There is, I do think there is something positive for the other world, the natural world, where Alice and I live. The bears are coming out. We've even had a moose appear. We hear about the canals in Venice, Italy, having jellyfish. We understand that skies are clear where they haven't been clear for years. I'm not optimistic, especially about our species. I sort of hold to that Robinson Jeffers line, be not in anything so moderate as in love of man. But I do think there is a display, if you will, a witnessing that the natural world can resume and to some degree heal if we're smart enough to treat it better. Who knows? But right now, animals are experiencing some new freedoms, certainly not all. The air is clearer, some of the water is better, on it goes.
I agree with Susan.
That's always nice, Billy. I like it when you agree with me.
Well, I mean, someone said there are you can hear ducks quacking on the Seine. And that's the title of a book of poems.
You know, I'll also say too, since I spoke with images of the dead, there's in the Odyssey, I think it's book 11, Odysseus goes down to the dead, and they have to be given blood in order to speak. And I felt through all this that poetry, like an evening like this, music, art, this is the blood that's keeping me alive. that's what it is, because I'm living in complete isolation. I'm totally alone, except for the communion, and I mean it in many, many ways, that I have with authors, artists, composers, musicians. That's very important to me.
I was going to say, this is Margaret again, that the Century just had an event, a virtual event where we asked people to send in haiku poems about isolation. And we had 23 people who qualified on theme and format, which was 3 lines, 17 syllables, first and third lines, 5 syllables, second line, 7 syllables. And we had a very interesting group of people who did feel that spring had mattered, but also about 5 of the poems were about birds, the things that soar above the earth and escape. It was very interesting. And they were some of them were about scenes of signs on doors, you know, closed and things. And so I just thought I would like to say mine, which was about, also it harks back to the Book of the Distant Mirror, which was the plague in times past. And it was face to face with none, just a distant mirror's back, is living alone.
Well, thanks for that.
We have a question from Alyssa, wondering how the poet's writing process has changed during the pandemic. Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Well, I write and I make soup. I will say that the 19-line villanelle, as Alice said, has served me. I've written more and more villanelles. I never imagined doing that, but then I never imagined making all this soup.
Holly, you know, this book opens. I'm a great fan of themed anthologies, but actually this book opens with a poem by Julia Alvarez and ends with a poem by Matthew Zabruder. So the A to Z was just irresistible. Mm-hmm. And on the subject of poetry itself, if I could just read Julia's poem, because it addresses this issue. How will this pandemic affect poetry? Will the lines be 6 feet apart? Will these hexameters be heroic like Homer's? Will each word have to be masked? Will there be poetry in security? Will there be enough poetry to go around? Will poems be our preferred form of travel? Will we undertake odysseys searching for Ithacas inside us? Will poetry go viral? Will its disease infect us? Will it help build up antibodies against indifference? Will poems be the only safe spaces where we can gather together, enter its immense silences, see snakes slithering inside sestinas, listen to its nightingales singing on the boughs of odes, hark, a lark in the terza rima, a hawk in a haiku. What if only poetry will see us through? What if this poem is the vaccine already working inside you?
So great.
Well, that's goddamn good, man. That's pretty good, Julia.
It's a good launch for the book, I think.
There's a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Alice.
No, and I was going to say, and it's so interesting to me that Matthew's poem, the last one in the book, ends with the lines, I love my son, his little bear pajamas, my wife, the grass, the ends of poems.
There's a question for Susan Consolving about thinking small. Could it be that small is more real, more in the moment, more mindful than the distracted way we often function? Could it be that we can get insight having to think small that we can carry forward?
I don't think that's a question. I think that's an excellent statement. Yes, absolutely. That was part of the idea of the poem, that we do attend to smaller things, because cognitively this global pandemic is really more than anyone can fathom, including, of course, scientists and poets. But we all understand a part of it from moment to moment, day to day. And yes, thank you for the question and the insight.
We have just a couple more questions here. What might be offered to readers who would choose to read all of the poems aloud, to feel them reverberate in the body and to feel the breath? I am comforted by having these poems to occupy the space of my isolated apartment. So I think that's a beautiful, beautiful comment.
Well, Gretchen, we have the audio book is being offered from Knopf right this minute. So, the poems are read by actors, because we didn't have access to gathering people or having them go to studios because of the virus. But I've been listening to it this afternoon, and it's really marvelous.
That's great. I guess this is more of a comment than a question. Someone wrote, I'm curious about the body, especially considering the social upheavals. Besides Garrett and Susan, the body seems to drop out, even in a context where the body or bodies are so foregrounded. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of questions concerning the recent protests, ongoing protests. For Alice and others, have you thought about how recent events, Black Lives Matter, and the global uprisings for racial justice may, in the midst of the pandemic, call for another collection to speak in dialogue with this one?
Yes, I think that will happen probably, but we do have an opportunity, because the hardcover isn't coming out until November, to include some poems addressing this moment, which, as I mentioned, I really feel is embryonically represented in the just previous one. And an example would be Major's line, "No more rallies of hate."
And there's another question along the same lines. It reads, my question is about the other crisis currently happening, and it is for the non-Black poets on the panel. What are you doing to amplify Black poets' voices and their work, specifically their poetry of witness about police murders of Black people?
I'll address that. We just had a meeting about those issues at my university, and it was an all college and I think all university meeting. As for myself, I try to do it through my modern poetry course. I try to do it in every way I can. And I bring in not only poetry by Black poets, but I bring in music, I bring in art, I bring in as much as I can. So I think that's very, very important. And when, I don't want to bring in things that, maybe aren't right for this evening, but when I was staying at the hotel in New York, because it was only a third full and I was the only person on my floor, the women who serviced the rooms each day would stay for over an hour. And one of the images that I can't get out of my mind, and that still makes me cry, a woman from Ghana who told me the story that her little son recently died. I think it was of this virus. He and his sister were sick. They lived 2 blocks from Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx. She walked with them, holding the hand of each. And when they got to the hospital, within a couple of hours, he went into septic shock and she lost him. And she began to tell me about her dreams about him. And I burst into tears. And when she saw me crying, she came over and she hugged me and said, "God loves you." And that stays with me. That really does. When I got back here, I found a neighbor who was very dear to me, a very kind, very generous woman, had died in the same way. Two other neighbors were very, very sick. I think this is all this virus. But I do think that when there's time, when people take time with each other individually, they get to know each other. And if there's trust, it's the trust that's so important. If one can risk it and open one's heart, I stay optimistic, even in the midst of all the horrific that's happened, that is happening. And I think nothing good will come of pessimism or cynicism, that one has to, I feel like, pull myself up out of the grave of myself. I feel it that way, and try one more time. No matter how many times I might have been misunderstood or rejected or whatever, I have to try again, because that's what it means to me to be alive. So that's my response to that. And I try with my students, no matter what responses I get from them.
I wanted to say that if you go to poets.org in July and August, we are dedicating that month to publishing Black poets and Black poetry of their experience. It's free. It's poets.org. We have Black curators who are curating the poems, and we're planning to do a whole lot of different things of having biographies of Black poets, and really, really making a big effort to make them part of the established sort of library of poetry in the United States. It's our commitment for the next several years.
A lot of you aren't going to like what I have to say, but I will say it. I think we have to think of this moment as a moment of opportunity to leave the stage, not to share it, not to use it as an opportunity for the display of white sensitivity, but to give up space, as the poets.org has done. I think more of that will go towards the diversification of the national voice, but also the witness of our national travesties and tragedies. If you get out of the space of yourself and you let that space be occupied by voices that have been silenced or denied, I think that's the most important thing we can do.
Garrett, I think though it is a naturally robust moment in our poetry, and the diversity.
It's been brewing for centuries. It's been brewing for centuries. For centuries it has been brewing. The moment has not been created by current events, but by centuries. It's not a cosmetic opportunity.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. Absolutely.
I think it's a fundamental opportunity, but also for a shift of consciousness, to think of experience not as opportunity for one's own display and performance, but as an opportunity for sacrifice.
I want to kind of echo some of what Garrett just said, because I feel like, not that there's a dissonance at all, but there's an interrelatedness between a pandemic that forces us to shelter in place, and a global health crisis that exposes inequities of all kind. And so going back to someone's question about, well, what is the positive aspect of this? As if nostalgia is necessarily a bad thing, but one of the positive is we have an opportunity to really pause, hit the reset button, contemplate our relationship to the natural world, of course, but also to each other. And I think that would have happened without the trigger of, unfortunately, another African-American man to police violence. You pull the two together, and what you have is this kind of really holistic understanding of where we need to kind of contemplate our own relationship, again, to each other and to the earth around us. It is a pretty profound moment, and it's one that has been accumulating, as many of you know, for many years. I think even beyond the amplification of voices that have been silenced, it really is going to require us to kind of think about our own humanity in relationship to others. No one's questioning, I don't think, the presence of Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer and trans poets, the value of that. But we need to open up spaces like this one here to those voices even more so now, because it is as much a spiritual quest as it is, and I would say it's spiritual life of the nation too. But this is a very, very important mystical moment right now, and it would be sad for us to lose this opportunity in a display of maybe forced empathy or empathy that fills of the moment.
Thanks for that, Major.
There's one last question here about time. Have the poets experienced a change in how time is experienced? I think we've all been thinking about that. Does anyone have a response?
Yeah, I don't know what day it is.
One of the poets referred to our days as Blur's days.
Yeah. And Auden said, time can say nothing but I told you so.
Yeah. That's good to be reminded of that. So
I remember, Alice, today's Bloom's Day,
Right.
which is also Zoom's Day.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so very much. And thanks, Gretchen and Alice.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Alice, and all the poets. There have been some questions about whether we've recorded this, and we are recording it. So go to our website in a few days, and we'll let you know how you can access that recording. And you should have gotten a confirmation with your link for this meeting, and that had a link to Knopf for pre-ordering the book or ordering the ebook. Thank you so much. And everyone be safe and well, and read more poetry and write more poetry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Alice.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you all for coming.
Bye-bye now.
It's so wonderful.
Major, are you still there?
Yes.
Yes, I want to tell you, we've never met, but I want to tell you, Chris Bouza sent me your introduction and your portfolio of poems for Provincetown Arts. So I just want to tell you how much I love it.
Oh, thank you, Susan. Thank you. And I'm a huge fan. We've never met, so it's really exciting to share this virtual space with you.
I will say the part of what's fun for me is just sitting here listening to you guys whose worlds overlap in certain ways, going way back and currently and in the future. And it's just really nice. It's like eavesdropping on a really cool thing. So really fun. And
My
the
old
fact
friend
that several-
Susan.
Yeah, and people said that these kind of things they feel like are helpful, and so maybe that's something we can think about. you know, going forward. Thank you all.
That's good, Holly.
Yeah.
Be happy.
Just
Take
love it.
care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.
Thanks.